realm of professional sports, stories of rise and fall are commonplace, but few tales are as poignant as that of the Melbourne Rebels, a team born of ambition, nurtured by passion, and ultimately consumed by the unforgiving nature of elite competition. Today, we delve into the heart of this rugby tragedy, exploring the factors that led to the demise of one of Australia's most promising rugby union teams. The dream of a Melbourne Super Rugby franchise was born out of a desire to expand the game beyond its traditional strongholds. In the early 2000s, Australian rugby was at a crossroads. The Western Force and the ACT Brumbies were holding their own, but there was a growing desire to expand the game in the nation's second largest city. Melbourne, with its passionate sporting culture, was seen as a perfect breeding ground for a new rugby powerhouse. After years of lobbying, the Melbourne Rebels were finally granted a Super Rugby license in 2010, in time for the expanded 2011 Super Rugby competition. The early days were filled with optimism and excitement. A new era of rugby was dawning in Melbourne, and the Rebels were the torchbearers. With top quality signings like Danny Cipriani and Gareth Delve, the Rebels looked poised to make their mark on Australian club rugby. The team's inaugural season in 2011 was a baptism of fire, but the raw talent and unwavering spirit of the players captivated fans. This was further reinforced by the fact that in their opening game alone, 24,000 fans would show up to a packed Amy Stadium to witness their side narrowly beat the Brumbies, 25 points to 24. The next season, the Rebels would improve from 15th place to 13th place in Super Rugby, most notably beating the New Zealand-based side Auckland Blues for the first time in their history. And a year later, they topped that again, finishing in 12th and in the process secured their first ever victory over a South African side against the Stormers. And off the pitch, positive changes were in full effect. On the 27th of June 2013, the Rebels announced that their shareholders had transferred their shares to the Victorian Rugby Union. The decision was made to promote the growth of rugby in Victoria, with both the community and professional arms working together on joint objectives. This was a bold decision from the Rebels, but would they be able to grow the sport? New shareholders weren't the only change the Rebels made, as ahead of the 2014 season, they announced Tony McGann as new head coach. There would be 15 debutants throughout the season, but despite all these new changes, they would finish last in 15th place, right back from where they'd started only a few seasons prior. A poor finish didn't look good for the Rebels, but was putting a financial drain on the Australian Rugby Union. The franchise was responsible for more than half of the Australian Rugby Union's deficit of $6.3 million Australian dollars in 2014. Things really needed to turn around for the Rebels now more than ever. Fortunately for the team, in the run-up to the 2015 season, they were a settled outfit with 20 of the players from the previous season being retained. As a result, the Rebels secured 7 wins across the season, the most in a season since their inception. They would finish strong in 10th place, but sadly this wasn't enough to keep them financially afloat, and as a result, the search for a new buyer was on. In June 2015, the Australian Rugby Union announced that the Rebels had been purchased by locally based Imperium Sports Management, led by Andrew Cox. With the new funds from the takeover, the Rebels would acquire 2 local talents in Sion Tuipulotu and Rob Liotta. Unfortunately, they were unable to replicate the previous season's form, and an injury crisis saw them slip to 12th place, but little did they know that things would get a lot worse from here. In an effort to bounce back from their injury crisis, the Rebels decided to sign 13 players. This sort of spending wasn't doing the team any favours, as it put pressure on the team to perform to make up for the losses. But to add insult to injury, during the 2017 season, the ARU announced that one Australian franchise would be axed from Super Rugby. As the competition was trimmed to 15 teams, the franchises at risk were the Rebels and the Western Force. In an attempt to save the franchise, CEO Andrew Cox, remember him from earlier, sold the franchise back to the Victorian Rugby Union for just $1. As the Victorian Rugby Union weren't likely to sell the franchise back to the Australian Rugby Union as they would axe it, whereas the Force were owned solely by the Australian Rugby Union. And as a result, On the 10th of August 2017, the force were instead axed from Super Rugby, with the Rebels surviving. In the 2018 season, they were jumped to 9th place, narrowly missing out on the playoffs. The next season was pretty similar, as they finished 11th, yet again missing out on the playoffs. But they were going to turn things around the next season. Despite the departures of experienced players like Quade Cooper and Adam Coleman, they were going to finish 3rd in the recently announced domestic Super Rugby AU League, making it the first time any Rebel side had made the playoffs. But sadly, they would lose the playoff final 25-13. 2021 saw another decline, as the Rebels narrowly missed out on the playoffs in Super Rugby AU, but slumped to 9th place in the new Super Rugby Trans-Tasman competition. 2022 saw a return of the regular Super Rugby format, but the results remained the same, as the Rebels finished in 10th place. In the 2023 season, the Rebels finished in 11th place. Despite this somewhat poor finish, head coach Kevin Foote and his coaching team were extended on their contracts for 3 years, alongside a number of multi-year squad signings to give stability to the squad. Though the Rebels look settled now, nothing could prepare them for what was to come. In January 2024, just a month ahead of the Super Rugby season, the Rebels were placed in voluntary administration, with over $22 million in debt owing to creditors, including $11.6 million to the Australian Taxation Office, $5.7 million to board members, $2.8 million to suppliers, almost $2 million owed to the Victorian government, and $1.1 million in unpaid stadium tenancy fees for use of Amy Park. The Rebels reportedly had just $17,300 in the bank, with assets including office furniture, gym equipment, and 2 cars. On the 14th of February 2024, it was reported that 10 administrative staff, including Chief Executive Baden Stevenson, were made redundant. A financial analysis revealed the Rebels lost $54 million in their 14-year history, or about $10,000 per day. But despite the hardship the Rebels were placed under, they would finish in 8th and qualify for the Super Rugby Pacific quarterfinals. However, they would be knocked out by the Hurricanes. The craziest thing is just a week before this, on the 30th of May 2024, several news outlets reported that Rugby Australia had rejected a private consortium's plan to fund the club until 2030, as the consortium's projections for revenue growth and cost savings were overly optimistic and posed an unacceptable level of risk. Consequently, the club was removed from further participation in Super Rugby at the end of the 2024 season. Lee Clifford, the head of the private consortium seeking to take over the Rebels, responded to the axing by pledging to take Rugby Australia to court over the decision, with Rugby Australia claiming to have a plan that will ensure rugby has a strong future in Victoria. It seems that no one knows for sure what the future holds for the Melbourne Rebels. So why did the Melbourne Rebels collapse? What went wrong? Why did a franchise with so much potential ultimately fail? The answer is complex and multifaceted. Financial struggles. Let's start with the financial aspect. Super Rugby is a notoriously expensive competition. The Rebels, as a relatively new franchise, struggle to secure the same level of sponsorship and revenue as their more established counterparts. This financial strain impacted the team's ability to not just recruit, but also retain top talent. On-field performance. While there were individual stars, the Rebels never managed to consistently put together a winning formula. The team lacked cohesion and struggled to build momentum. In a highly competitive league, this inconsistency proved fatal. Rugby landscape. The broader landscape of Australian rugby also played a role. The dominance of New Zealand teams, coupled with the rise of South African franchises, made it increasingly difficult for Australian teams to compete. The Rebels, as the youngest of the Australian teams, were particularly vulnerable to these challenges. But perhaps the most significant factor in the Rebels' demise was the broader issue of Rugby Australia's financial health. The governing body was and still is facing its own financial crisis, and as a result, tough decisions had to be made.
Decided to shut down the club after 14 seasons. They rejected.
But was this really the right decision? With the rise of rugby league, rugby union's appeal in Australia continues to be on the decline. Though axing the Rebels may be a financially viable option in the short term, in the long term, it could have a detrimental impact in trying to revive the popularity of rugby union in Australia. The Melbourne Rebels were more than just a rugby team. They were a symbol of hope for a city hungry for sporting success. Their journey, marked by both triumphs and tribulations, serves as a stark reminder of the complexities and challenges faced by professional sports franchises, and the importance of building a sustainable model for success. As we reflect on the Rebels' time in Super Rugby, we are left with a sense of what could have been, but perhaps it is in the face of adversity that we truly discover the strength of a community. With an average attendance of just over 9,000, the passion and loyalty displayed by Rebels fans during their team's final years. But do you think the Melbourne Rebels could return in some capacity? And do you think that could be to Super Rugby? Put your thoughts in the comments down below. While you're down there, hit the like button and subscribe. With that all said and done, it's been your boy John Talks Rugby, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to click on screen now to watch my video on the story of Antoine Dupont. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.